Okay, so I apologize in advance. This one's going to be a little bit long. There's a lot of information here. So let's get on it. Impact of agricultural practices. So the Green Revolution, which was in a previous screencast, remember what it did is it basically prevented widespread global starvation, especially in areas like China and India and the Philippines and Mexico. So all over the world, they were able to save people from starving to death. And the way they were able to do that is by basically designing new strains of crops. And this is before there was genetic engineering. They just had to do it through standard breeding practices. But they designed these high yield monocultures. So like they designed these crops of wheat and rice and things like that that produce a lot of food energy per unit of land. And that was able to feed the world. Now, but in order to do this, they had to rely on an increased use of synthetic herbicides and pesticides to protect these crops. They had to use more synthetic fertilizers to get them to grow. It required the use of machinery in order to till the land to prepare it for to take the seeds, and also relied on a lot of water. I mean, a lot of water to get these plants to grow. Now, it worked. We saved a lot of the world from starving to death, and it actually led to a lot of development in the world, which has been very beneficial. But it came at a cost. And so let's just look at what that is. All right. So one thing is, it was based on using a very small number of crops. And so that's what we call a monoculture. So people plant large areas of one thing. And so basically, when you do that, you tend to have very low biodiversity in terms of the number of species. There's in this picture here, there's just wheat, there's one species. And there's low genetic biodiversity because we tend to use just a few strains that are purchased from a particular supplier. So you have just a few genetic strains that are designed to be particularly high in producing what we call photosynthetes, photosynthetic products that then can be eaten by human beings. And so there's very little in the way of diversity. And remember, a lack of biodiversity makes things susceptible to things like pests and other problems. In fact, you might have heard of the Great Famine or the Potato Famine that happened in uh, the 1800s, I believe it was, in uh, my mom's from there in Ireland. All right. And basically, what happens is when you have monocultures and then something goes wrong, that lack of biodiversity makes them particularly susceptible for the spread of disease. And so that happened in Ireland. They all had this one kind of potato and it fed everybody. And then it got this kind of blight, this kind of fungal infection. And people just starved to death. It's just like all the fields died. Okay. So that's the problem with having low biodiversity is when there are environmental stressors such as drought or pests or some other kind of competition, these monocultures tend to be susceptible to wide scale collapse, which can be catastrophic to people who rely on them for food. Now, what the Green Revolution did is it basically bred specific grains of rice and wheat that, like I said, have a lot of food energy per unit of acre. And so they're really great at providing the world with food, but they need a lot of support in order to grow successfully. And that support does come at a high cost. So one of the things it requires is a lot of artificial fertilizers. So in order to get these plants to grow rapidly, like they're capable of, you've got to give them nitrogen, you've got to give them phosphorus and potassium, and without them, they just can't grow. So, well, it takes a lot of energy to produce these, and there's problems associated with them. So basically, here's what happens with synthetic fertilizers as opposed to natural ones like manure or just old plant matter. And that is that it takes a lot of fossil fuels to make them. I mean, you have to have factories that manufacture these things. And so there's a vastly increased carbon footprint associated with the production of artificial fertilizers. And the other thing too is that they're very water soluble, and you can put so much of them in the land that it just can't absorb them all. So they tend to get into rivers and streams and groundwater and cause a host of problems once they get there. Now, the main problem we have with fertilizers when they get into surface waters is they lead to a problem called eutrophication. And so, and that's something that we're going to cover in just a separate screencast because it's such a big deal. But eutrophication basically goes like this: if you put a whole bunch of nutrients into surface water, then what happens is the streams and lakes in which those nutrients are arriving are able to support vast, rapid growths of plant life, especially algae and that tends to cause the death of many of the creatures that live in these waters. So, and again, we'll talk about that later, but eutrophication is a real problem because it's very disruptive to ecosystems. You might think that all this extra productivity would be a good thing, but it actually leads to a collapse of the aquatic ecosystem. So, the arrival of these nitrates and phosphates into surface waters is actually a very detrimental thing. Now, the other thing that happens is that these nitrates and phosphates, they're so abundant in the soil when we put them down these farms, and we irrigate a lot, so there's a lot of water that they'll dissolve and they'll get carried down, they'll infiltrate down, and they'll join the groundwater, and they'll just flow with that groundwater, and it can take a long time, decades, but they'll be flowing through the ground, and then they'll arrive at a lake or a stream where they recharge, where the water comes out of the ground and into the lakes or streams, and then it causes that eutrophication problem. The other thing too is if people drink that water, especially the nitrate can cause a problem with our hemoglobin, especially in babies, and it can cause this blue baby condition where basically instead of making hemoglobin, you're making this stuff called methemoglobin that basically doesn't carry oxygen. So it's not really considered to be a major problem, but it is a problem associated with groundwater contamination by nitrates. Now, another thing about a monoculture is, just like with a potato blight, you're susceptible to invasive organisms. Okay, so if you get a worm, a grub, an insect, a fungus that begins to infect it, you can lose the whole crop. And so, in order to prevent that from happening, it's necessary to treat these crops with things that kill the organisms that might kill them. So you have to have things like pesticides to kill animals, mostly insects. You have to have herbicides to kill weeds. You have to have fungicides to kill funguses. And so you're putting a lot of these chemicals on the crops. Now, pesticides are particularly bad for human beings because they tend to contain a thing called organophosphates, and many of these things are known to be carcinogens, and also many of them also are lipid soluble, so they dissolve into fats, and they are fairly persistent. So they're those POPs, those persistent organic phosphates, and they tend to bioaccumulate because of that. Now, some of them are worse, like DDT we've gotten rid of, but most of them do it to some extent. It's still a problem. Now, pesticides tend to be what we call broad spectrum. That means you spray them on, they pretty much kill most bugs, okay? But herbicides are different. So an herbicide kills plants. Well, I'm spraying on my plants. I don't want to kill my plants, right? So they have to be more targeted, what we call narrow spectrum. I want them to kill the plants that are not the ones I'm growing, and I want them to kill the ones that are the weeds that are trying to outcompete my plants. And that can be a little bit tricky. And one of the most successful of these is a product called Roundup, which is made by a company called Monsanto. Now, the thing about Roundup is it is a pretty good in terms of like low toxicity towards humans. It affects enough weeds that it's very effective, but it still is a problem because it can kill the plants that people are trying to grow. But they found a way around that by genetically altering the plants that go into the crops so that they're resistant to this. We'll get to that in a minute. Now, one of the problems with using pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides is they have a tendency to degrade the soil by killing the bacteria that live in the soil. So remember, soil is a living thing. It's not just dirt. There's a lot of life in the soil. There's a lot of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. There's a lot of nitrifying bacteria. It's an important part of the ecosystem. And when you dump these chemicals on it, you tend to kill a lot of these single-cell creatures that are very beneficial to this ecosystem. And so what we find is over time, the farmlands become less productive because these chemicals have basically killed the bacteria that were present in the soil that were so necessary for it to be healthy. And then there's the problem of chemical resistance. All right, so this has to do with basically natural selection, or I guess unnatural selection. So basically it goes like this. All right, if I spray pesticides, and the same is true for herbicides and fungicides. Let's just talk about pesticides. All right, so if I spray pesticides on a population of bugs, some of them are just going to die because that's what it's designed to do. But some of them might have just a genetic mutation that makes them resistant. They're less likely to die when you spray it on. So I like this diagram. Look, I've got a whole bunch. Whatever. I've got like 7 of these blue bugs and 2 of these red ones. Now look what happens. The 2 red ones, they survive because they're resistant to it. Most of the other ones died. Now all of these are going to reproduce, right? But now what happens is I spray again, and now what happens is none of the red ones die off, but most of the blue ones die off. So now you can see what's happening. The percentage of the population that is resistant is going to go up. And this is just basically, this is how selection works. This is basically natural selection, whereas the stressor is in this case the selective pressure is coming from this chemical. But we find it with medicines, we find it with herbicides, pesticides, fungicides. Organisms become resistant over time, and this is a problem because you end up with these what we call superbugs that are just really hard to kill. Now, one of the solutions to this is a modern one. We sometimes call this the second green revolution, which is underway. And so the second green revolution involves genetic engineering. So with genetic engineering, what we're able to do is we're able to use techniques like CRISPR and some other ones to splice out genes from one organism and then splice them into the genome of another organism. And that other organism, in the case of agriculture, is a plant. So we can take some genetic code out of whatever organism we want, often a bacteria, and place it into the genome of a plant, allowing it to make a certain gene. So this right here is a DNA sequence for making a certain protein, which the plant didn't make, but the bacteria did. Well, now the plant makes that protein, and that protein can be very, very beneficial. So that's basically how we genetically engineer these plants. We call them GMOs, for genetically modified organisms. So let's just look at a couple of these. Okay, one is called BT. So BT is Bacillus thuringiensis. Okay, it's a soil bacteria, and this soil bacteria makes a protein. This protein kills many larval insects. So when they're in that sort of caterpillary stage, we sometimes call them worms. Really, they're larval insects, and it's normally located in the soil. But we're able to snip that out of the bacteria, put it into plants. Now the plants are producing that toxin. They don't do it normally, and you couldn't breed them to do that, but you can insert this gene in there. So these BT crops are basically, they are in and of themselves toxic to insects. So it's great because you've modified these plants, but now you don't have to spray them with either any pesticides or with very little pesticides. So in that sense, it's a very great thing. Then there are herbicide tolerant crops, and going back to Roundup with the Monsanto company, they're the ones that made this. So basically, they were able to genetically modify plant genomes so that they are not affected. Basically, there's certain plants that are not affected by Roundup, but a lot of the plants that we put on our farms are affected by it. So they're like, well, I know what I'll do. I'll just find a plant that's not affected by Roundup. I'll splice out whatever gene it is in that plant that makes it resistant to Roundup and splice it into my corn or my wheat or my whatever. And now my crop is resistant. So now I can spray all the Roundup on I want, and it won't kill my crop. And this is being used a lot today. So, but there's a couple problems. Okay, the company that makes this herbicide also makes the seed. So you got to give all your money to this company. It makes a monopoly here, right? But just keep going with the positives before I start talking about the negatives. Another positive is you can make plants that are resistant to drought. So there are many plant species, when it dries up, they die. Okay. Well, a lot of places in the world, they don't have access to irrigation the way we do in the developed worlds, and so they go hungry when this happens, especially with climate change making droughts more common. But what they're finding is you can find plants that are more drought tolerant, drought resistant, find the genes that make them that way, and then splice them into the plants that people want to grow. And then they're plants that normally would have died when it dried up, they don't. So, I mean, these are all great things. So this really is a second green revolution, and it's necessary because the World Health Organization is looking at mostly sub-Saharan Africa, going like, these people are growing very fast and they're quickly going to outrun their food, which is what led to the first green revolution. So this genetically modified green revolution is something that could save a lot of human lives. But there are some concerns. Some of the concerns are this. First, those genes might escape, and there might be some crossover that will get these genes to start showing up in other parts of the ecosystem where we didn't intend them to be. Also, two, there's certain insects we want to kill, but there's certain ones we don't. A classic one is monarch butterflies are being affected by this because this gene got into milkweed, and this milkweed is now producing chemicals that kill these monarch butterflies, which is a beautiful butterfly species that we're losing. This also leads to a reduction in biodiversity because now there's only just a handful of these crops that people are starting to plant, and you have this corporate control of the farm community, so that there's just something a little bit unnerving about having all that human, the potential for human suffering in the hands of certain companies. And the other thing is we're getting these herbicide-resistant superweeds. So remember, in the case of the herbicide-resistant strains, what we're doing is we're still spraying herbicides like crazy, and the plants that we modify don't die, but the plants we're trying to kill usually do. But as always happens, there'll be some of them that are just genetically, prone not to die, and they survive, and then we end up with these super weeds that are really, really hard to kill. Now, another thing that's a problem is mechanized tilling. In order to get the soil ready, so what you do is you have farmers that go out with they have these plows and these tillers, and they just turn the soil under, so you can take all these weeds, put them underground, and then you make these furrows. You put your seeds in, and you know what? It's a fast and efficient way of turning land into farmland, but it comes at a cost. Okay, so basically, yes, it does get rid of weeds, and you can turn manure and other nutrients into the ground, and you provide a place for the seeds to grow. But what happens is, over time, what we find is tilling tends to decrease the porosity and increase the density of soil. So there's less, so it just becomes dense and less porous, which also makes it less permeable. So you get less infiltration into the soil and more runoff. Well, when you get increased runoff, you get increased erosion. So we're tending to lose soil, and it tends to blow away. And it also is causing a decrease in the bacteria, which is making the soils less fertile. So unfortunately, it's a fast, efficient way of getting crops to grow, but after a while, it makes the land unusable. So it's become quite a problem. But people have found ways around it, which we'll talk about in a different presentation. And the last thing I promise is this: we need to talk about irrigation. So these plants need water, and so like a lot of these new green revolution plants are very water hungry, and you've got to get water on them, which means you've got to irrigate your crop. Well, how do you do that? Well, you need to be near a source of water. It can either be groundwater, river, aquifer. So a lot of rivers got dammed in order to provide water to irrigate these crops, and a lot of aquifers have gotten heavily mined, if you will, of their water in order to do this. Now, there's different types of irrigation. All right, there's surface irrigation, sprinkler irrigation, central pivot, lateral move. There's other ones too, but let's just look at these in turn. Okay. Surface irrigation is very wasteful. Basically, you just have these furrows between the plants, and you just flood the field, and some of that water sinks in, but you can see a lot of it is going to run off, and worse yet, a lot of it just evaporates up into the air. Now, sprinkler irrigation is a little bit less wasteful. It uses less water, so there's less evaporation that occurs, but it's still, with these little tiny drops, there's a lot of evaporation that occurs. So it's definitely somewhat wasteful. Central pivot, you just have these central areas, like a circular path. You have this sprinkler system that just goes around in a circle. The state I come from, it looks like something an alien did. Okay, but it's basically what it is this: it's these moving like arms that spray water, and they're a little bit less wasteful than those other sprinkler systems. These lateral move ones are just like the others, except they just move in a straight line rather than around in a circle. So those are the ways we irrigate. But it takes a lot of water to get these crops to grow. And what does that mean? Well, we end up with depletion. Okay, so here's the things that happen. One is you can cause the salinization of water, you can leach nutrients from the soil, and you can run out of your water resources. Let's talk about salinization. So basically, when the water goes in, it dissolves some of the minerals, and those ionic compounds, which are going to be salts, are in the water. Now, irrigation often happens on a sunny day where there's a lot of evaporation. So what happens is that wicks the water back up to the surface, and those ions that got dissolved out of the minerals are now at the surface. And when it evaporates, you end up with this layer of salt at the surface, and that makes it very difficult for plants to grow. Basically, osmotic pressure is such that they just can't get water into their root system. So salinization of soil is catastrophic, and it definitely is caused by irrigation. Oops. I guess I didn't do the other one, but then we have depletion of water resources. So basically, people are fighting all over the world. We'll do a separate screencast on this, fighting for this water. So this is a classic case here. This is the Aral Sea, which is in Kazakhstan. And basically, the Soviet Union said, look, we're just going to dam the river that flows into it and use it for irrigation purposes. Now, keep in mind, 80% of the fresh water used on our planet by humans is not used to drink. It's not used for showering or cleaning or anything. It's used for agriculture, 80%, or maybe even more of it. And so basically, when you take you dam these rivers and you use them for irrigation, well, that means whoever's downstream from you runs out of it. And this entire lake, which was one of the largest lakes on the planet, it had boat traffic, it had islands, it had, it was just a huge fishery. It was a major source of income for the people who lived in Kazakhstan. Now it's just a desert. It's a classic case of what happens when you divert water for one use and you have these unintended consequences. Okay, sorry that was a long one, but thank you for listening.